This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jang chu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chunyan gi pe sunam gi dola penchir sangye tu parshog Sangye chodang soki choknam la jang chu bardu dakni kyab suchi Daki chunyen gi peso nam gi dola penshir sangye druparsho. Okay, you can set the prayer books aside and we'll do a short meditation before we begin the class. We'll do a few minutes of quiet meditation on the breath as we usually do, and follow that up with a short guided meditation to set motivation for tonight. So just find a good meditation posture and begin to work with the breath. And if you have a technique that you already use, then by all means, feel free to do that for the next few minutes. If not, as usual, I suggest this sensation in the area of the nostrils, where we feel the air coming in and out when we breathe in and exhale. So bringing your awareness to the breath, in whatever way, the job is always to try to hold your awareness there as best as you can, to maintain that attention, that mindfulness of the breath. But when you see that you've lost the awareness of the breath, that suddenly you're thinking about something that you're planning for the future, or something that happened in the past, or perhaps a sound from the street or whatever might happen, when that distraction has occurred, there's no need for any judgment. Just simply acknowledge that and gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight's teaching. So now let's set our motivation for being here. And in this course, as you know, we're working on discerning this middle way view, this wisdom that will help us to undermine the ignorance that we've been under the control of since beginningless time. And it kind of boggles the mind to think about beginningless lives. Every one of those lives, we were under the control of this factor, not knowing reality, but moreover, misknowing reality, thinking that things exist in this intrinsic, inherent, substantial way, contrary to how they actually exist. And if we think about the fact that no doubt we must have come into contact with these teachings at some other time in the past, if we didn't, well then certainly that explains why we aren't liberated yet, why we haven't become a Buddha yet, is because we haven't met those teachings. But if we did meet these teachings in another lifetime, one of these many lifetimes we've had since beginningless time, well then we obviously didn't have the strength of mind to be able to use that wisdom, to cultivate it deeply. So it is important when we approach these teachings to really strengthen our desire to use the time that we have together very well. Initially, with the understanding that this is the key to attaining one's own liberation, to removing one's own ignorance, all the afflictions that are built upon that, and be able to be free of the cycle of existence, no longer a being in samsara, rather one who has attained the peace of nirvana. This is at least the motivation that we want to bring to these teachings on emptiness. But because other beings need to hear these teachings as well, because other beings are under the control of their ignorance in the same way that we are and have been, it would be ideal to hold the motivation of wanting to discern this middle way view most correctly so that we then can become the source of that wisdom for others, help them to know the wisdom that will undermine their ignorance and help them to achieve liberation and enlightenment. And therefore, we set that higher motivation, the motivation of bodhicitta, that aspires to become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings. So really hold that thought of the good fortune that you have now to have met with these teachings in this lifetime, but that strong desire to use this life well then, to make sure that we continue to progress to liberation and enlightenment, and be able to help all sentient beings to attain those same goals. Okay, so welcome to this, I don't know what number class we're at now. I have no idea, I've lost track. We will probably be continuing with this for the remainder of my time here in Santa Fe through the end of April, or roughly the end of April. Depending on whether we finish the text or not, we'll just continue meeting on this topic probably, and just maybe do some meditation on emptiness, so people get more familiar with the techniques for realizing emptiness. So we are again in the third of the 3 chapters that His Holiness the Dalai Lama cites from Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom when he teaches on this text. Chapter 26 on the 12 links of dependent arising that indicate how we go from life to life through the very intricate process of these 12 factors that contribute to our circling in samsara. The root one, the number one of those 12 being ignorance. Then we went on to chapter 18 where we talked about an examination of the self. Particularly looking at the emptiness of this I that we cling to so tightly, thinking it's inherently existent when it doesn't have even an atom of that. And so that's kind of to, clearly understand ultimate truth. The 3 chapters to help us to understand conventional reality, how things actually happen in conventional terms. In the 3rd chapter that we're examining now, which is chapter 24, It's called an examination of the Four Noble Truths, but that's because, as you know, we started off with some objections being raised, where people are saying, well, if you've just, said what you said and discerned this middle way point of view, well, they're misinterpreting it, and they're thinking that that means that then nothing exists, that the Four Noble Truths can't be upheld in that the three jewels can't exist within that, which of course is not what Nagarjuna is saying at all. So he comes out with that statement in, I think it's around stanza 6 or 7, where he essentially says, obviously, you don't know the purpose of teaching emptiness, the meaning of emptiness, the nature of emptiness. You must be very confused. And so essentially that's verse 7. And he essentially says in verse 8, which is kind of where we left off and what we're going into a discussion on, let's actually read verse 8 together. The Buddha's teaching of the Dharma is based entirely on the two truths, the truth of worldly convention and the ultimate truth. So again, this is where Nagarjuna is saying that if we don't have a clear understanding of how there are two truths that can be posited, again, they have different status because conventional truth doesn't have the same status as ultimate truth, and they are found by two different forms of valid cognition. But nonetheless, these are two things that can be shown to exist within the nature of all phenomena. Everything that exists has both its conventional nature as well as its ultimate nature. Something that we can find on deeper investigation is its emptiness, which is the ultimate truth. Something we identify simply through convention, through our establishing it through worldly terms and ideas, is what we mean by conventional truth. We're not looking at things deeper than that when we're identifying conventional truth. And in fact, as we explored when we looked at the handout from with some passages from a couple of Guy Newland's works, we discern that conventional truth actually has that root meaning in the Sanskrit of samvriti, as well as gunsop denpa, which is how it's identified in Tibetan, of being truth for a concealer, truth for a mind that is together with ignorance. That's because, once more, everything that appears to that mind with ignorance is appearing to inherently exist. It appears to exist on its own, self-established, independently existing. And so we cling to that false appearance. We have believed in that false appearance since beginningless time. Our belief in that, through having this conception of inherent existence, has created the imprints by which we have that false appearance. It's a vicious circle that we're caught up in, that we have to first begin to stop believing in that appearance. Stop adhering to that. So essentially, but all of the conventionalities, we can say, again, are established through the force of a mind that is together with ignorance, because it's how we organize the world that we live in. But of course, once we organize it that way, we think it exists as that, as what we've identified it as. It seems to have its own entity, self-established, existing by way of its own characteristics. So again, this is how everything appears to us, and this is how we are assenting to everything. So most beings don't even go into an investigation beyond that. They just assume that everything exists in the way that it appears, and they cling to it without even knowing that they're clinging to a false appearance. It's only when we encounter the Buddhist teachings that we come to understand that what we identify as conventional truths are not truths at all, because they don't exist in the way they appear. But we don't really understand that until we understand ultimate truth, until we get the fact that things don't exist in this intrinsic way, independent way, inherent way. And then we can understand the very subtle way that they actually do exist. Which once more, in the end, we find that things are merely imputed, merely designated through thought and conception. We just are labeling things. We use language to do that, but it's primarily a conceptual process by which, once more, we organize the world. But that's all that there is. Organizing it into chairs and tables and cushions and all the other things that we have in the room is simply our own way of taking these bases and giving them some identity so that we all can relate to them, so that we all can have some way of kind of functioning in the world. So again, conventional truth and ultimate truth do have different status, but they are still, in the end, going to be posited in regard to every single phenomenon. So there are myriad numbers of conventional truths matched with myriad numbers of ultimate truths, every phenomenon together with its own emptiness. So we went through all of Guy Newland's pretty much. There were like the last couple points I didn't go through, but we will cover those as we go through Tsongkhapa's text. So I didn't really want to go back over the handout, but were there any additional questions from what we talked about or the handout on the two truths? Remember, as I said earlier, hopefully when Geshe-la returns in May, he'll begin his, or resume his study of and teaching of the middle length Lam Rim, and you will hopefully all be diving into the special insight section. I don't know whether you'll get to the two truths again later this year, but Tsongkhapa's middle length Lam Rim has a wonderful explanation of the two truths within it. That's actually why Lama Zopa was keen on us studying that as part of the basic program, was because of the presentation of the two truths in that text. So if there are no questions from anybody, then what I'd like to do, and I do have again that little extra copy of Ocean of Reasoning, if anybody would like to use it to refer to. Might not make any difference whether you have a copy in front of you. We're getting into this one little section again. It does go on for a bit, and I'm going to try not to go through it in a really labored way. I want to do it in a rather, not quite a quick way, but certainly a little bit more abbreviated way so that we don't spend too much time investigating the two truths. They are coming up in the verses that follow as well. But Tsongkhapa takes this opportunity right after verse 8. Verse 8 in his text is on page 479 of Ocean of Reasoning, translated by Geshe Ngawang Samten and J. Garfield. And we went through the first part of this all the way down to that very bottom sentence that starts this new paragraph. That's where I left off when we went into the discussion of the two truths. So essentially we have, again, Tsongkhapa doing a little diversion here, taking the time to explain the two truths in much more detail because he feels that there's a necessity to do that. Because obviously this whole thing was based on this idea that if we don't correctly understand the two truths, we can misunderstand emptiness. We can fall into a nihilistic bent in particular, because this is the big danger with undertaking a study of emptiness, right? I mean, emptiness doesn't, it's hard to, I mean, we can not refute enough, certainly, and we can still reify existence to a large degree. But through studying emptiness, the tendency is not to think that things still have some sort of inherent nature when we're done. It's that things don't exist at all. We find it really hard to reconcile having conventional reality in the midst of them lacking inherent existence, because we are so strongly holding to this idea that things have to have some intrinsic identity, that, you know, when we identify it as a book, it has to have something from its side that makes it a book. There's got to be some bookness here, or else why would we call it a book, right? I mean, this is just our normal way of relating to things. So this is what Tsongkhapa is going to spend a bit more time looking at. So on the very bottom of page 479, then, he starts by saying, well, not starts, but we're going to start tonight by him saying, convention refers to lack of understanding or ignorance. That is, that which obscures or conceals the way things really are. This is explained in this way as the Sanskrit term for convention, samvriti. Was that how it would be pronounced, Bob? Or is there another like vowel in there somewhere? Samvriti? Samvriti. Yeah. Samvriti. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't know Sanskrit, so it's nice to have someone who studied it in the room. So again, this term, or even gunsop, again, which is what the gunsop denpa is what's referring to as truth, gunsop as convention. So it can mean concealment as well, but not all conventions are said to be concealers. This is because, again, you know, we can still talk about things having a conventional nature. Even emptiness, we have to say, has a conventional nature because it is only established through mere designation. There is no inherent existence to emptiness, obviously. So we can talk about a conventional nature of emptiness, but it isn't a conventional truth. So everything that is established is a convention, has a conventional quality to it, together with its emptiness. And if you talk about emptiness itself as being the conventional nature, then it's together with the emptiness of emptiness. And then if you talk about the emptiness of emptiness, and you talk about the emptiness of emptiness of emptiness, you could go on ad infinitum, because, you know, there's no end to the phenomena that we could find that would have that qualification when we start working with emptiness itself. But with regard to everything that exists, this is mostly where we are talking about things being concealers or together with a concealer. They are conventional because they're established through the force of a mind that's together with ignorance. Because it's, you know, the minds of ordinary beings that are identifying the things in the world that they relate to and are, you know, experiencing and so on. And that, by the way, this whole section, there is a, I don't remember the exact page numbers, but there's a whole corresponding section. It's quite a number of pages in the Two Truths. I think it's around, it's the chapter 5, Meanings of Samvriti and Paramartha. Paramartha being the ultimate truth in Sanskrit. So it goes through kind of the different, these different meanings. The very first one being this idea of truth for a concealer, this concealer quality. Then the second one, it says alternatively, this is towards the top of page 480, convention can be taken to mean mutually dependent or interdependent. Since things must be mutually dependent, the meaning of untrue is that they do not essentially have the ability to stand on their own. This approach to explaining the meaning of the word is applicable to ultimate truth as well. Why? Because ultimate truth is also interdependent, mutually dependent. It doesn't stand on its own. And there's no phenomenon that stands on its own. You cannot find something that has the ability to establish itself independent of other factors. So in this way, we would say that definitely, you know, ultimate truth would fall into this because emptiness would be also mutually dependent. But the word conventional, he says here, is not used to refer to it. This is like, for example, the word grown from the lake, which is literally applicable to a frog, but is not used to refer to a frog. The term grown from the lake is actually the term they give to a lotus, it says in the footnote. So you would call a lotus grown from the lake. And you could call a frog it, because a frog is grown from the lake, right? Because the tadpoles go in the lake and then they become frogs. But you wouldn't use that term because it's a term that's chosen for the lotus. Anyway, this is, so I don't know, doesn't really explain that much more. But the idea here is that when we use the second meaning of samvriti, we are referring to the fact that there is a conventional quality to it, that there is something that is this mutually interdependent phenomenon that is part of that category. Much more so in that way, because we certainly talk about, when we talk about interdependent, we are talking about not just causes and conditions, but all the other factors that play into dependent arising. So that's the second meaning. And once more, you can read much more on that. These are chapter 5 from like page 76 through about, I don't know, he covers conventional and conventional truth for quite a number of pages, up to around page 90, 89. So then the third meaning, alternatively, convention or gunzop, can be taken to mean signifier, that is mundane nominal convention. So I think Guy Newland uses a slightly different term there rather than signifier. I think he uses actually the term conventions. So he used, again, truth for a concealer, the idea of concealment, then the idea of interdependence, and then finally the idea of literally conventions, things that are established through mutual agreement on as to what we are calling them and relating to them as. So he says here, it can be taken to mean signifier or convention, that is mundane nominal convention. Convention in this sense is also said to be characterized by expressions and the objects of expressions, awareness and objects of awareness, and so on. Therefore, subjective convention does not refer merely to expressions or to awareness. Anyway, he's just going into the different meanings of this gunzo. So out of those three, which one do you think is the closest to what we're talking about here in terms of conventional truth? Signifier, okay. Any other votes? We'll have a caucuses on it. I would say probably that I think even Guy Newland says this after he goes through all three. He would say that really it's mostly the first meaning that is closest to what is being talked about here, the truth for a concealer. Once more, because if we really talk about, you know, again, yes, there are some things that we could say have some conventional nature, and emptiness being the big one, that aren't really concealed in regard to that. You know, there isn't the concealment component involved in emptiness. Nonetheless, this is really what we're getting at, is the fact that there is a adherence to them as existing in the way that they appear, that is not in line with their reality. And in this way, that concealer, which is the mind together with that ignorance, is not really knowing conventional truths in the right way. It's thinking that they are truth in the way that we would think ultimate truth is true. And they aren't. They don't have that level of reality. So this is actually the one that Guy Newland, I think, says is closest to the meaning that we're really getting at here in regard to the Gunzop Denpa. Suppose one asks, Tsongkhapa continues, does not the use of mundane in the expression mundane convention, this third meaning, mean that there is convention that is not mundane or worldly? Here the word mundane is not used to exclude some non-mundane convention. It just expresses the way things exist. In other words, those whose perceptions are erroneous because of deterioration of the sense faculties due to such things as cataracts, growths on the eye, or jaundice do not constitute the world from the perspective of which things are regarded as conventionally real. So it's just saying that, our way of talking about mundane convention or worldly convention is in the view of those who don't have some impairment to their awareness. It's just what we all agree upon as what the world can generally say exists, the colors of the sky and whatever the case might be. Sure, Gil.
You're wearing glasses.
Uh-huh.
So aren't you impaired?
I guess depending upon the quality of my glasses. But I would only be impaired in regard to things that I would be called upon to know by virtue of my not wearing glasses. So if I don't wear glasses, I'm nearsighted. So I could see, like, if you asked me to read something that was on the back wall, I obviously wouldn't be the right person to correctly identify the conventional words that are written on the back wall.
Isn't that the same for everybody, even if they don't wear glasses? Is there some kind of perfect eyesight that we're in?
No, because I think somebody who does have the vision that allows them to see the letters of a word that was written on the wall would be reliable in terms of being able to identify what the word is that's back there. But if I'm close enough to it and can identify it, I'm an equally valid cognizer of that conventional truth, which are the words that are written on that back wall. It's just, anytime that there's an impairment that doesn't allow, like Bob's mentioned, your color blindness, you wouldn't be a correct person in terms of your valid cognition of color when it comes to the colors that the general part of the world does see. I mean, I don't know what percentage of the population has color blindness. It's probably pretty significant, but nonetheless, there is a larger part of the population that seems to be able to register the light waves that are hitting surfaces and what comes back reflects back to the eye, yeah, I mean, we are only talking about knowing things in a conventional way, being able to correctly identify what something is that the world agrees upon. We're not talking about, again, that person being impaired with regard to realizing emptiness, because they could realize emptiness. It's just when it comes to certain things in the world, they're not the measure of whether that exists or not. And the examples that are used here are like the hairs, the falling hairs happening to someone who has cataracts. Well, they are not, although they're having that appearance, we're not denying their appearance. They're having an appearance of falling hairs, or somebody who's, taking a hallucinogenic substance and having all sorts of things appear to them. You can say they are having those appearances, but they are not a valid cognition of those appearances in terms of establishing their reality in conventional terms. Because while they're seeing everything going wild in front of them, everyone else in the room who didn't take the hallucinogenic substance is not seeing those things. So convention does have an idea of it being a larger part of the world. But there always has to be a basis for something, and then some agreement as to what we're going to call that basis, how we're going to establish it in the world. So does that lead to more questions, or?
Yeah, Bob knows that color of walls,
Yeah. Yeah. So what's the question? I'm not sure.
But he's not a valid cognition,
Okay.
according to what you were saying. But he still has a cognition.
And he can know it through his mental consciousness. So I'm sorry, so the folks who are online, the question had to do with, again, because I'm wearing glasses, am I not a valid cognizer for, things because I have some impairment to my eye faculty? With regard to, now the question you have with regard to Bob is, Bob will know that the wall is yellow because others have told him that the wall is yellow. I don't know, how does yellow appear? Does yellow appear to you okay? Red and green usually, yeah. Right. So you can be a valid cognizer with regard to the color yellow without any problem. With regard to red and green, well, you've probably come to discern what people call red and what people call green and what you're seeing when people see red and green. So you've come to understand that. But as an initial valid cognition of those colors, you wouldn't have the ability to establish those colors.
Like, you know, I think more commonly,
No.
for ordinary people, we know things are, you know, real or not real. There's either a chair or there's not a chair.
Right.
But at that level, you know, I think also Kappa is saying is that conventionally, you know, even an ordinary,
Right.
common people, you have a sense of what's real or not real.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you've got these different levels of reality. Because even in the common world, we can talk about something that's imaginative or something that actually is a real physical object.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have another level, which is this ultimate reality.
Mm-hmm.
So we're saying that even conventional reality,
Right.
you know, so it's interesting because we're actually distinguishing different levels of reality.
So in short, what Bob said was, again, what he's assessing Tsongkhapa to be talking to is not, you know, the agreement that there's a chair in the room, the agreement that there's, you know, a tanka on the wall or whatever the case might be. Some of these that are more general ways of talking about things, but it does lead to some queries about like, well, then how are things all established? Because again, we can't say that everything, because as you said, there's a lot of room for imagination in the world. We can't mean that possibly because there's a preponderance of people who believe in something, who have established a basis for something and thereby a label for it, that exists. Just like you can't take the fact that all these minds that are together with ignorance think everything inherently exists as truth. Because essentially when it comes down to establishing a conventional phenomenon, we have three things that need to be there. And actually these were talked about, I think did I mention these last time? They're in the middle way here by His Holiness. It's on page 106. First of all, it must be something that is familiar to the world's convention. So this is the first element of it, is that, you know, if I start talking about there being, you know, a three-headed monkey that has an elephant ears or something, you know, like I start talking about something that's really outside of convention that I think I'm seeing all over the place. Well, obviously, you know, if the world can't establish that in conjunction with me, then there's some problem. So that's the first one. That's like a pretty broad stroke. It must be some familiar to the world's convention. Secondly, it must not be invalidated by other conventionally valid knowledge or cognizers. So if another valid cognizer can refute that, such as, for example, again, somebody seeing something that they're hallucinating that isn't actually established there. And if other people can say, no, that isn't actually there, then you've refuted that as a conventional truth. You can refute it as something that we can agree upon exists conventionally. But third, it must also not be invalidated by ultimate analysis. That gets rid of this overlay of inherent existence that we all are adhering to, that we all think exists and are intent upon, you know, kind of believing in that. That would be invalidated by an ultimate valid cognizer, and when it finds the emptiness of that. So there are two ways that you would refute that something from that bigger bucket, that bigger, broader stroke. So again, I don't want to get into too deep a discussion on this, but certainly there are some things that other spiritual traditions would propound as existing that the Buddha wouldn't have a problem saying, no, that there is no, I mean, even look at the grossest form of selflessness that the Buddha posits, which is the anatman, the lack of a soul or an atman that is taught in the Vedic traditions. Well, the Buddha's, you know, kind of recognizing that as something we can refute is on the basis of it not being able to be established in conventional terms. We cannot find a basis that we can identify that is suitable to be identified as Atman. Can you find something that is permanent, independent of causes and conditions, and unitary? That is the self, that is kind of the soul, the essence of that being. So the Buddha would simply refute that on the basis of kind of a conventional analysis. He would say, I don't find that Atman to exist here. It's not yet an ultimate analysis because it's not looking for emptiness. at least in my understanding. I think it would not yet be the ultimate analysis in this case, but it nonetheless can be refuted. No, I mean, you can get into all kinds of things that other spiritual traditions might propound about the world and how the world came into existence and all the various things about it. I don't want to go down that avenue of like, how would we refute each one of those things? But nonetheless, it would be a similar process where the Buddha would say, can we refute it through either one of those two? If it might be accepted by the world at large, for example, a creator God. I would guess that most people on this planet, I don't know, maybe if it's a majority, but certainly a large number of people on this planet believe that there's a creator God. They're part of a theistic tradition. Is that enough to establish it as a conventional truth? Is that giving it that status as an existent, as something that we can posit? I don't think that's enough. Again, because we have those two additional steps. I have to be able to find whether it can be refuted by some other conventional valid cognition. Albeit, even though it might be in a minority of the world, if there are valid cognitions that refute it, well, there might be reasons why other people continue to believe in that. I don't know. I don't want to get into some huge theological discussion, but I think that this is where we do have to take a look at what this is really getting at when we start talking about what we mean by conventional truth. It doesn't mean anything goes. Just because somebody comes up with it, somebody imagines it, somebody does something to create it, therefore it's there. I mean, there's no problem with thinking Harry Potter as the imaginary character that J.K. Rowling, created through her writings and what have you. But if you think Harry Potter really exists, then you have another level that's kind of a problem. So I don't know if this helps or not, but this is the stickier part of it, is what do we really mean by a conventional truth? Because it has to be, when we look at this, we're going to get into this in a moment, objects of knowledge is the bigger category, which means everything that exists. Existence, objects of knowledge, phenomena, all of these are mutually inclusive, and they mean everything that exists. And objects of knowledge are going to be one of two things. They're either going to be a conventional truth or an ultimate truth. They can't be both, and if it exists, it can't be neither. It has to be one of those. Okay? Is everybody okay? All right, let me continue a little bit here then. So it says, then maybe I don't need to go through the rest of this on that paragraph. Therefore, I'll go through the last bit. Therefore, those perceptual objects affected by sense faculties, which are affected by such things as cataracts, are not regarded as real according to mundane convention. Therefore, in order to distinguish it from these, the word truth is qualified in the expression mundane conventional truth. So again, once more, these are not really truths. They are truths in the perspective of a mind that's together with ignorance, because that mind believes and thinks that they exist in the way that they appear. That's the measure of truth in this whole discussion, is does it exist in the way that it appears? And for a mind with ignorance, it appears to inherently exist, and they adhere to that as if it were true. But they are not really truths because they don't exist that way. So then there's another outline where, there's one more little bit, which is just the briefest comment about ultimate truth. Since it is a fact, Tsongkhapa says, and it is supreme, it is called the ultimate. So this is Don Dam Dempa. Don means fact or truth, or actual, I guess would be a better word for that rather than truth. And Dam means supreme, like the highest fact, the highest actual existent. So lexically, it says in the footnote, ultimate is a Tibetan compound of supreme fact. The same etymology is present in the Sanskrit paramartha. So again, this is it's a non-deceptive phenomenon. In that way, it is truth because it appears and exists in the same way. Emptiness doesn't appear to inherently exist to the mind that is knowing it directly. To the mind, our minds, while we think about emptiness, yes, it appears to inherently exist because everything that appears to our minds appears to inherently exist until we're in meditative equipoise on emptiness. That's right, I was going to talk about meditative equipoise at some point, wasn't I? Yeah, I went back and I located my text and I forgot to bring it in with me tonight. But again, we are essentially talking about in meditative equipoise. This is when a yogi or yogini, whoever, goes into a deep state of meditation where they are focused on emptiness. Generally, it starts with the selflessness of the person, the emptiness of I. They go into that meditation having done, many, many sessions of fine-tuning their awareness so that the veil between the subjective awareness and the object of emptiness has become very, very thin. And at that moment when they go into this meditation and that veil falls away and emptiness is known in this direct, non-conceptual way, they say it's as if water is poured into water. There's no longer any distinguishing of the mind and emptiness, the object that is known by the mind. There's no subjective, objective discrimination at that point. One goes into that, and there is, again, two parts to it. And the meditative equipoise is always a meditation on emptiness that has that quality to it. And there is the uninterrupted path where in the space of that realization of emptiness, an antidote to a level of the obscurations is produced. Then there is the liberated path, or the path of release, which is when that has been kind of gotten rid of, that level of obscuration, so it will no longer occur again. They say these are comparable to taking the thief and putting him outside your door and then closing the door so the thief will never come back in. So it's kind of like two moments of mind that are both a meditation on emptiness in which this process takes place. Those obscurations having been removed through the force of that wisdom, and they will no longer appear again. No longer have that ignorance again at that level. You still have to go through all the various levels of obscurations down to the very subtle ones. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this context, what's most relevant for equipoise is the belief that they directly see reality.
Yeah.
So,
or the experience of directly seeing reality. Yeah.
They directly.
Yeah.
And so in a certain sense, they are the only people who are true valid cognizers.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Directly as it is.
Right. So Bob was pointing out kind of again where this discussion went from, which is again the idea that they can actually know this supreme fact in ways that no one else who hasn't had that experience knows that supreme fact. We can say we can have a valid cognition of ultimate truth prior to that to some degree, but it isn't really an exact, knowledge of it because we haven't had that experience yet of it appearing and existing in the exact same way that it is occurring. So when emptiness appears to that mind and it is known by that mind, there's no discordancy whatsoever. It is known in the way that it appears and that it exists. Emptiness is free of all of that. It's without any of that taint. So again, it says it's not deceptive from the perspective of those who perceive things as they really are. So it's those who've had that experience of a direct, non-conceptual awareness of emptiness. So now we get into this little bit where it does talk about these in more detail. It says, as Prasanapada says here, the details of the two truths can be understood through the presentation in Madhyamakavatara. This is why the Madhyamakavatara, Chandrakirti's text, is what we study in the master's program based on the fact they study it in the monasteries. It's said to be one of the best texts to study with the wisdom of emptiness in the middle way school, as well as, of course, the two truths. So he says a brief presentation follows, and brief for Tsongkhapa is what, about 10 pages, 20 pages. So there's quite a few pages on this that goes, it's maybe, closer to 20 before he goes back into the text again. It's up through page 497, and we're at, 481 now. So not quite 20 pages, but. So he says at the top of page 481, objects of knowledge constitute the basis of division of the two truths. The conventional truth and the ultimate truth are the entities that are the divisions of objects of knowledge. In order to understand these divisions, the three topics must be addressed: conventional truth, ultimate truth, and the presentation of the enumeration of the two truths, kind of to understand that everything is succinct within those two. So he's going to go into each of those, and within each of those there are additional parts. First is conventional truth, and he says it has three parts. First, an explanation of the etymologies of conventional and truth. Again, I won't go into that quite so much because we've talked about some of that. The characteristics of conventional truth and the classifications of conventional truth. So that first section, explaining the etymologies of conventional and truth, or again, gunsop and denpa, or samvriti and truth. What is truth in the Sanskrit? Yeah, I can't. Satya.
I keep thinking sattva, which is being.
Yeah. Okay, satya. So again, this first section on the etymology of these. Suppose someone asks, "What is convention and what is truth?" The convention, from the perspective of which such things are as form are posited as true, is the ignorance which fabricates the essential existence of phenomena which do not inherently exist. So this is what we talked about previously, right? So we don't need to spend too much time through. We're talking about those things that are established as true from the perspective of a mind that's together with ignorance. This is because, since it is not possible for things to truly exist, it is only from the perspective of mind that things can be posited as truly existent. This is the only place where that fabrication occurs is in our own minds. It's our own minds that are creating that true existence, inherent existence, ultimate existence, all this on phenomena. We are overlaying on top of what is there, which again, nothing is inherently there, this factor of inherent existence. And from the perspective of the mind that does not grasp things as truly existent, nothing is posited as truly existent. Once more, from the mind of somebody who's in that meditative equipoise and comes out of that experience even, they know that nothing can be posited as existing in that way. This is fiction that we are making up. It's pure fabrication. So he says, thus, Madhyamakavatara says, and there's a verse from chapter 6, which is, of course, the huge chapter in Madhyamakavatara. It's on the perfection of wisdom. And I'm going to actually read a different translation of that because, I don't know, I find sometimes Garfield's terminology not to work as well for me. Maybe you'll have the same experience, but this is verse 28 from chapter 6, as it is in the... this is a translation. I don't even remember who did this translation from the auto commentary of Chandrakirti. Someone translated the root verses. Because confusion obscures self-nature, it is all concealing. In other words, it's deceptive. Whatever fabrication appears as true due to that, the Muni taught as truth for a concealer, or what we call deceptive truth, conventional truth. Fabricated things are all concealing, are deceptive. All the fabrication that we in creating the world around us through naming it, and then moreover thinking that it inherently exists, all of this is deceptive. Because again, we think that those things that have been merely designated, merely posited by our consciousness, by our conceptual mind, have some intrinsic existence. Through the force of that ignorance, we are fabricating a reality that is deceptive, that is concealing the fact that it doesn't have that at all, that it is empty of that. It's the ultimate truth is being concealed. Again, I just liked that translation a little better than what they have in the book. And then let's skip over the commentary, because again, I think that we are, quite clear on all of this, that again, it's those who are together with the mind of ignorance that are establishing these phenomena. So at the top of page 482, this next section, he says, this is again, the same thing about the etymology. He says, this does not demonstrate that first, those who posit the existence of obscurational truth or conventional truth posit it actually through that ignorance, because that would be problematic. Because if everything we identified as conventional truth through the force of our ignorance existed, then inherently existent objects would exist. And they don't exist. So we aren't saying through that ignorance that things are posited. It's a mind together with that ignorance that posits what is conventional truth. Is it everyone getting the subtlety between that? Again, my mind can establish things that I learned to call a book and to call a camera and to call a computer and whatever the case might be. That's the mind, my mind's together with ignorance. It is the concealed from that reality and positing those phenomena. That's what we mean by conventional truth, or actual existence, things that we can actually posit as existing in our conventional terms. But if I was talking about what my ignorance was establishing, in quotes, because it's not really established, it's only fabricated by my ignorance, then an inherently existent cup, an inherently existent camera, an inherently existent computer. Well, those aren't conventional truths because they don't exist at all. So we're not talking about inherently existent objects being in that category. So he says those who posit the existence of obscurational truth, that somehow they would be posited through ignorance, that's not what we're talking about, nor that from the perspective of these beings, the hearers, solitary realizers, and bodhisattvas who have abandoned afflictive ignorance, it is not posited as conventional truth. It doesn't also mean that once you've gotten to that other side of the river and you are together with the mind that is no longer having any ignorance present in it at all, you've annihilated all the afflictive obscurations, that from that vantage point, when you look at conventional truth, you say it doesn't exist at all. So he's saying neither of those things are true about this. It's not that, again, our ignorance is actually positing what is conventional truth, nor is it that from the view of that wisdom, that conventional truth is denied. Conventional truth is upheld within this, but once more, only as mundane conventions, only as what we are establishing through the force of our convention, and not inherently existent in the least. So he explains each of those a little bit more. Maybe it'll help after my explanation, which may not be perfect. He says here, the reason for the first, again, that these, they aren't posited through ignorance, is that, as has been previously explained, since it is through afflictive ignorance that one grasps things as truly existent, the object that is thereby grasped cannot possibly exist, even conventionally. And whatever is an obscurational truth must exist conventionally. So again, when you're talking about the mind that is the mind of ignorance, when ignorance is present in our minds as in a manifest way, and we are thereby adhering to things as inherently existent, that can't be what we're talking about as the mind that establishes conventional truth, because it would be establishing something that doesn't exist. And conventional truths have to exist. The second one, that from the vantage point of those beings who have abandoned all the ignorance and afflictions, that somehow they're negating conventional truth, that somehow in their eyes it doesn't exist at all. He goes on to talk about that in the next paragraph. He says, the reason for the second is that for those who have abandoned the obscuration of afflictive ignorance, because of the absence of that obscuration in virtue of which they take things as real, from the perspective in which things are posited as truly existent, compounded phenomena are established as not being truths from their perspective, but it is not established that they are not obscurational truths. So again, from the vantage point of that being who has that perfected wisdom, who has developed their mind to that degree, and they no longer have that ignorance, they can see that what ordinary beings are looking at and thinking exists inherently, that there is no truth to that at all. But they don't deny that there's an object there nonetheless, because the object still exists. Because recall that once more, the object exists through the force of the three levels of dependent arising, through the force of its causes and conditions, dependent upon those, dependent upon its parts, and dependent upon the designating consciousness, the imputing consciousness, the imputation of that. So I won't read all the rest of these because, again, I think you can spend some time with these later if you'd like, or even go into Guy Newland's book to investigate this more. But essentially, when we are talking about obscurational or conventional truths, we are talking about something that exists, but is not truth in that it doesn't exist in the way that it appears. So cup exists, inherently existent cup that appears to me and that I adhere to doesn't exist. Nonetheless, the basis for my fabrication, as well as the basis for the emptiness of that object, do exist. All those things exist. I don't know if I need to go through the rest of this. I was already going to skip over a good part of what's remaining in this section. So that gets us to some idea of the etymology. That again, while we use this word of truth for a concealer, we aren't talking about it being that actual ignorance establishing what exists, because it would only establish inherently existent phenomena, and that doesn't exist at all. And we are simply talking about what we establish through the force of our worldly convention. And as His Holiness said in that explanation, something that there is worldly convention to its some agreement, but then there is also no invalidation by a conventional valid cognition. There is also no invalidation through the force of an ultimate analysis, an ultimate valid cognition. Because both of those valid cognitions do take priority, do have some ability to discern their respective objects. So, characteristic of conventional truth. Let's do a little bit more on this. I need to keep the clock in my awareness so that I don't go over here. But Tsongkhapa starts off this by saying each of the internal and external phenomena has two natures. So each phenomenon that exists has two natures, as an ultimate and a conventional nature. The sprout, for instance, has a nature that is found by a rational cognitive process, which sees the real nature of the phenomenon as it is, and a nature that is found by a conventional cognitive process, which perceives deceptive or unreal objects. So we have two different cognitive processes involved. They're the same mind in the end. When we are able to discern emptiness, it's with the same mind, but it's a different avenue of investigating. Again, in terms of establishing a sprout as existing, all it takes is my, valid eye consciousness, seeing what has come to be labeled as sprout, what we agree upon as sprout, and me through my mental consciousness giving it that designation. Oh, look, there's a sprout. It's a mind that is obscured to its true nature, but nonetheless, it is a valid conventional process for identifying all the various things in our world. But there's an ultimate valid, cognizing process, or a valid cognitive process, which is getting at the ultimate nature of that. How does that sprout really exist? And does it exist in the way that it appears, moreover? And when, as we know from our investigation and our studies of emptiness, when we pursue that ultimate analysis, we don't find that it has any ultimate existence, any final existence. Instead, we find its emptiness, which is ultimate truth. But nonetheless, it doesn't have any final existence that we find. We only find the lack of that. We're going to get into a discussion of that later with ultimate truth, because it makes it sound like, again, we're finding in, what are we finding? We're not finding an affirmative phenomenon, again, as we've been talking about. We're finding the lack of something, an absence of something. These are two cognitive processes in regard to anything that exists. Whether we're looking for it conventionally, just to simply establish it. Is there, a table in the room? Yes, there's a table in the room. But what is the real nature of the table? How does that table actually exist? And does it exist the way it appears? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I think for ordinary people, most of the time, 99.9% of the time in the world, we do see things conventionally. We look at a chair, we say, or we look at a table, oh, it's made of wood, it has this color, it has this shape. We're all looking at all of those conventional aspects. Because almost nobody ever thinks about how this
Yeah.
exists. It's only when you start thinking about how it really exists, then you get into trouble with things inherently exist. Although I guess they do say that things appear to inherently exist. About our thinking about it.
Sure.
Like they're sort of real and out there, exist from their own side. Nonetheless, when we talk about things and we say whether it's really there or not, we say, oh yeah, I can bump into it, so I can see it, I can touch it. So yeah,
Right.
It is really there.
So yeah, Bob's just talking about how we have all these, most of us just simply being in the conventional world, and most beings not really even questioning that ultimate nature of things. And part of it being, as you pointed out, that we've been talking about this conventional, or the appearance of things as inherently existent, of all the conventional things in the world. And we're not just talking about, again, we put a lot of onus on our sight, like seeing things. Oh, there's the chair. I see the chair. So that, and it appears to my eye consciousness in that way. It appears to all of our consciousnesses in that way. My sense consciousness on, feeling the smoothness of the page of the book, that smoothness is appearing to my tactile consciousness as if it inherently existed, as if the smoothness was inherent in this page of the book. It's with everything we hear, everything we smell, everything we taste. It has that false appearance. But again, the ignorance is operative in that it adheres to that, it assents to that, it agrees with it, it believes in it totally. And unless, as Bob's pointing out, you're introduced to some idea of questioning it, you probably don't go to that extent. I mean, even the Western philosophers, Wittgenstein and all these folks haven't, in my estimation, and what I've read on it, which is very little, haven't really found that truth, haven't really gone to the extent that the Buddha talked about in terms of emptiness. They can talk about conventional language and linguistics and the way of referring to things, but they haven't gone as deeply into that because they haven't really investigated, as you were pointing out, what is reality? What is real? We got into a discussion some classes ago about who decides what this word real means even. And if we start using different ways of talking about what we mean by real. Because once more, we would never get to a point where we say there is absolutely no reality at all, because that would deny the two truths, right? It would deny that there's some level of functioning going on here. There's something that is real, but it's not real in the way we think of real. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Aristotle is the one person who
Yeah.
really sort of presents the thing we're trying to negate. He says everything has this
That's, yeah.
essential character,
Uh-huh.
which is what it is.
Yeah. So Bob's saying that Aristotle kind of started to give words to like the object of negation, to a sense, to say things have kind of that essence or something that is what it is, you know. Well, even in that phrase, it's from Shakespeare, right? A rose by any other name is still a rose. You know, it's like it's got its roseness there, regardless of what we call it. we have this strong idea that things have that, because again, it's not something we're purely making up. It's not like we're living in a world where we're just totally off kilter. Everything once more appears that way, so we're just agreeing to how it appears. You know. And what came first, the false appearance or the false, adherence? It's a chicken and an egg thing, right? Because it goes back without any beginning. So there was no initial moment when something falsely appeared and then we agreed to it, or we started thinking of things that way and then they appeared that way back. It's just we've been wrapped up in this. And unless beings, this is what I was kind of pointing out in regard to the meditation tonight, was that unless beings are introduced to that concept, to be able to look at reality and say, what's really going on here? Well, then they never do that. That's why we keep going from life to life. That's why we must have come across these teachings at some point in the past. But if we didn't, well, then that's one explanation. Since beginningless time, I've never heard teachings on emptiness. Therefore, I've never even questioned it. Wow, how unfortunate that I went all those lifetimes without even having some desire to investigate the nature of reality and find out this truth that will be liberating, that will actually allow me to be free of all of this. But of course, the other one is it would probably be more likely that I've run into these teachings before. But what did I do with them? I mustn't have paid very close attention, or I mustn't have done my meditation or my homework or something, because I'm still together with that ignorance. So it's really important that, again, we discern very clearly what this is, not for our own sake alone, but so that we can also tell others of this. We can also help others to form that same wisdom. So he says, this shows that from among the two natures of the sprout, the two truths about the sprout, the ultimate nature of the sprout is found by the former cognitive process, and the conventional nature is found by the latter cognitive process. But this does not show that a single nature is in fact two truths in virtue of the two perspectives of the former and latter cognitive processes. In other words, it's not like we're just finding one thing. We do talk about them being the same nature, but they're nonetheless completely isolatable and actually very different phenomena. Emptiness itself is a permanent phenomenon, an unchanging phenomenon. It doesn't arise from causes and conditions. It's not compounded. It is a unchanging phenomenon throughout the duration of the existence of that object to which it is intimately bound to. Whereas many of the phenomena over on the other side are permanent. We do have some, impermanent. We do have some permanent phenomena, but the large bulk of what we deal with over on this side is impermanent. The self, for example, that we've been analyzing in chapter 18, the self is an impermanent phenomenon. Its emptiness is a permanent phenomenon. Nonetheless, the self and its emptiness can inextricably bound up in each other. We can identify them from two different perspectives, two different cognitive processes, but they're part and parcel of the same nature. But they're not a single object. If they were a single object, then I'm not going to go into this whole explanation. We did that as part of one of the classes. I can't remember. I think I sometimes teach that when I do even the Discovering Buddhism module on emptiness. So maybe it's taking people too far into it, but there's a whole investigation of reasons why they can't be exactly identical in a single nature. Why? One of the biggest reasons is once I realize cup, thermal cup, well, then I realized emptiness of thermal cup, right? Because it's the same nature. I mean, identical, not just beyond same nature, but identical nature. There's obviously not an identical nature of the emptiness of thermal cup and the conventional nature of thermal cup, or else once I realized one, I would realize the other. And I don't, right? You have to go pretty deeply to realize the emptiness of it. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I mean, it's no different from saying, you know, we look at a cup, look at it from the perspective of its color,
Mm-hmm.
or we can look at it from the perspective of its shape.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the same object,
Right.
but we're just examining two different aspects.
Sure, sure.
And in this way, it's like we're either examining conventional characteristics of an object, which would be the conventional truth, or we're examining how it exists ultimately.
Right, right,
So we're just looking at the same object in different ways.
right.
Looking at different aspects.
Oh. Yeah, so Bob was just pointing out, again, for those online, that in the same way that if we talk about the cup, we could talk about the color of the cup, the shape of the cup, what have you. And those are the same object that's being analyzed. It's just a different aspect of it, if you will, a different perspective. So it's here too. We're looking at the conventional nature of the cup, which is simply establishing it as such through our a conventional agreement and so on. And then the ultimate nature of the cup, which is a much deeper investigation again. It goes beyond just what appears, because once more, most beings aren't even aware of that false appearance. They're just buying into reality the way that it appears and not even questioning it. So let's see what else I want to share from this section. So maybe, yeah, at the bottom, not quite bottom, the second to last paragraph, this is page 483 still, since the reality of the sprout is its essence, it is called its nature. Since such things as the shape and color of the sprout are also called its identity, they are also called its nature. So we can talk about an ultimate nature and a conventional nature. There's no problem with that again. In order to ascertain a pot, for instance, as a deceptive or unreal object, it is necessary to develop the view that refutes, through a rational cognitive process, the object of fixation that is that object grasped as truly existent. This is what we've been saying all along. We need to have some process of that ultimate analysis that gets at whether this object exists in the way that it appears. He says this is because without having rationally refuted its true existence, its unreality is not established by authoritative cognition, valid cognition. So for the mind to establish anything as an object of conventional truth, it must depend upon the refutation of its ultimate existence. This is once more, again, yeah, we can say that we are all functioning in the world of conventional truth, but we don't really even know conventional truth as such until we know ultimate truth. Because once more, we think that conventional truth is ultimate truth. Because beings don't even go to that extent of ultimately analyzing, but they hold on to everything in the world as if it was real in the way that it appeared. So they've conflated the two ideas of ultimate and conventional in the world that they relate to. You don't really come to understand what conventional is until you understand what ultimate is. If you go and investigate ultimate truth and come to understand the emptiness of everything that exists, every one of those objects, then you can establish its conventional nature. That it is a conventional truth arising in dependence upon its various factors while maintaining its emptiness. So really, this dichotomy, these divisions into the two truths of all objects of knowledge, isn't really something that we do philosophically until we have begun that whole process of investigating into the ultimate nature of things. This is essentially what I believe Tsongkhapa is saying there, is that until you get into an examination of ultimate existence of things and refuting it. Again, once more, keep in mind that this word ultimate gets thrown around a lot. Ultimate truth is not ultimate existence. Ultimate existence is what we're looking for, things to exist in the end in the way that they appear, to find that inherently existent sprout or person and point to it and say, there you are, I found you. Ultimate truth is what one finds based on that investigation, which is the nature of things not having that we cannot find that. Okay, so it's tricky because here again it says it depends upon the refutation of its ultimate existence, because nothing exists ultimately, not even emptiness exists ultimately. Okay, let me just read one little more here. No, I don't know that I need to read too much more of all this. Let's kind of skip over the rest of this, because once more, you're welcome to read these on your own. And some sections are a little bit denser than others, as Tsongkhapa tends to be. But nonetheless, if you kind of follow it very clearly, slowly, you can sometimes, pick up the same meaning. And he just seems to reiterate a lot of these things. Let's take a little break here to see if there are any questions. It's about 8 o'clock. Or any other comments or things that, yeah, Stephen.
Just a terminology question that
Okay.
confuses me a little bit. So when we talk about an object of knowledge, we say that object of knowledge is the ultimate nature of something. Can we really say that though? Because I guess my question is, are we not having direct realization without subject or object of something's ultimate nature? So therefore it cannot be an object of knowledge. In fact, what we are having is we have an experience that we can recollect or recall, but it is not the actual experience of having a direct realization of emptiness. Does that make any sense?
I'm not sure. Let me see if I can explain it to those online. So so Stephen's question is, when we say that we're finding the ultimate nature of things, because the experience that occurs in that meditative equipoise, this is what you're referring to, when there is kind of this falling away of subject and object, this water poured into water experience, that there's some question you're having about whether we can say that that constitutes a knowledge that could be establishing the object of knowledge that is ultimate truths, that is emptinesses of phenomena, what have you. Because that knowledge in your purview is not the knowledge that would be required to establish it, but I'm not sure I'm getting that part of it.
Yeah, I guess maybe I can simplify it a little bit. It's not there in emptiness. There is no subject or object. So how can there be an object of knowledge? In fact,
oh, okay. So it's the object part more than
the recollection of that experience.
The object of knowledge would be the recollection of the experience. See, but I think what we're doing is because if at that moment, I agree with you, at the moment when you are having emptiness appear to the mind in that meditative equipoise, nothing else appears in terms of any conventional phenomena. They cannot appear because in the space of emptiness, that is all that is appearing. So you don't have object in the sense of something outside of oneself that one is knowing. Moreover, you don't even have knowledge in a sense because there's no subjective awareness that is present at the time that is having that awareness of the object in a separate way. But I think, again, that's maybe, again, even the term object of knowledge is a bit conditioned by conventionality, by the fact that we are only knowing things through our limited experience to this point. But when we talk about the meditative equipoise of an Arya being, we're of course talking about a transcendent knowledge that is the ultimate knowledge, that is the final knowledge that we all have to have of things, that is not to be discredited in any way, nor seen as incapable of establishing objects of knowledge. It establishes the highest object of knowledge. Again, that's why we call it the supreme fact, truth, Dondam Dempa, is because it's finding we call it an experience, but the mind is there. I mean, it's not like the mind's gone somewhere else during that time. The mind is there going through this experience of knowing emptiness directly. There's a knowledge, a wisdom that is occurring. That's why we call it the perfection of wisdom for the bodhisattva, who's together with bodhicitta having that awareness. So I don't know that I have the problem. I think because once more, we're talking about the difference between mundane awareness and supramundane awareness. Something that transcends worldly existence versus something that is bound up by worldly existence and conditioning. So our way of knowing things and validating things is done through our conceptual minds. This is a non-conceptual awareness. I mean, not just our conceptual minds, because obviously our senses are also picking up things and validly knowing things. But what I'm saying is that all of that is mundane, whereas the knowledge of a bodhisattva or any being who's an Arya being realizing emptiness is supreme, is a knowledge that's surpassed that, transcended that. So I don't know if I have the same problem.
Couldn't that be knowledge of the opposite of emptiness? Or not the opposite, but like you say, goes beyond it. And couldn't that be that how things are all connected and interdependent?
So Anna's bringing up the idea of, yeah, could it be the other side of emptiness, in a sense, the awareness of the interdependence of all things? Again, that's a conventional truth, though. So we would never, in the space of that meditative equipoise, one wouldn't have that cognition coming into one's awareness, because that's not ultimate truth. That's not emptiness. So after in subsequent attainment, once one exits one's meditative equipoise, then probably, yes, there would be a profound awareness of the interconnectedness of all things, and the lack of any independent, inherently existent thing. Even though things appear that way, there would be this knowledge that pervades one's awareness of the world around oneself. But I don't think in the space of that meditative equipoise that could possibly appear. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I think when you're in meditative equipoise, it's
Oh.
beyond language.
Yeah.
No reference or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Or any concepts
I
of,
think when
yeah.
you're talking about, whether things are ultimately or conventionally objects of knowledge, it's after somebody has come out of meditative equipoise and is in the normal space again. At that point, they can look at an object and they just,
Right.
from their experience, they instantly know that it doesn't exist the way it appears. So they
Right.
realize that as an ultimate truth. But I think whenever you're doing these sort of speech about objects of knowledge, you're in a conventional truth.
But nonetheless, so Bob's saying that, yeah, in his estimation, that when one comes out of meditative equipoise, then one can certainly discern the objects of knowledge that are conventional truths versus the ultimate truths that are the emptiness of those objects. But nonetheless, I mean, again, if we go back to what Tsongkhapa said just a page or two ago before, we have this whole idea that objects of knowledge, page 481, constitute the basis of division of the two truths. The conventional truth and the ultimate truth are the entities that are the divisions of object of knowledge. And why he goes into this whole explanation is that we understand that those are found through two separate processes of valid cognition. And we have to say that the Arya's meditative equipoise on emptiness is a valid cognition. It would be a misgiving to say that. And it establishes ultimate truth, the ultimate truth of whatever phenomenon was being analyzed to come up with that awareness of emptiness. Generally, again, the person is the first object that one analyzes and realizes emptiness on the basis of in that state. So we have to say that objects of knowledge are posited through valid cognition, and that valid cognition can be a conventional valid cognizer, or it can be an ultimate valid cognizer. And it can be known as such in conventional terms after the fact, but known in the way that it actually appears only occurs during meditative equipoise, or until when one becomes a Buddha. Then of course it's happening all the time. But so I don't know, it's interesting stuff to noodle over. But it is an interesting term, because objects of knowledge, by its very presentation, means something we were talking about conventionally, that we are looking at through conventional terminology and how we are discerning things, discriminating things. In the space of the wisdom realizing emptiness, none of that is existing, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a valid cognizer of its object, albeit in this way that is inexpressible, that's non-conceptual, that is impossible for us to even put words to, really.
So whether an object of knowledge is conventional or ultimate, really it just comes down to the mode of cognition of the sentient being, of the cognite. Reality isn't different. There's no transcendent reality. It's just reality. Just how that sentient being is perceiving that reality.
And then that's the whole crux of it, really, when it comes down to it. So Stephen was just saying, we can't say that reality changes or is somehow, different on the basis of it's always been that way. I mean, this is the most comforting thing to me when I think about it, is like emptiness has always existed and things have never had an atom of inherent existence. It's all been a fabrication on my part. I don't know if that's that comforting, but it's the idea that it's not like there's, again, some transformation that happens to the world around me. It's the transformation that happens within me. Because if I see the fallacy of all of that false thinking and then come to understand and discern these two truths in the most correct way, well, then I've come to know reality as it is. I've come to know things as they actually are and always have been and always will be. So.
We just can't talk about it.
Shh. No, but this is again, and different Buddhist systems, of course, have different ways of approaching this. This is why, again, if you go to like, a Zen center, you're not going to get this kind of Tsongkhapa approach to how to look at it and pick it apart and analyze it and, do all these things, because there seems to be a reliance in this tradition upon that artifice of conceptual thinking to get us to the ultimate truth, to get us to emptiness. And there are many other approaches where people don't go that route, where they go into a much different type of way of approaching it, experiential more than rational reasoning, logic. Were you going to ask or comment? Yeah. A question from the folks online.
This is from Todd. For context, can dawn provide an example of permanent phenomena?
Okay.
I did hear him say there are some permanent phenomena, right?
Yes. There are generally 4 categories of phenomena that are impermanent phenomena. I don't know if there's more than this, but essentially what's called uncompounded space, uncomposed space, which is the absence of obstructive contact. So when we talk about the fact that we are able to be in this room, it's because there is an absence of unobstructive contact. So it's not talking about a physical space that we're locating. It's just talking about an absence, a negation. Just like emptiness is a negation. That's why sometimes they talk about space-like emptiness, because there are similarities between these two in terms of them being a pure negation. Space in this context is an absence of obstructive contact, which is what allows for things to be in the space that they are in, to inhabit that physical space. But nonetheless, we're talking about that way of getting at space through an absence, a negation. That's one. The other 2 are, that before we get to emptiness, which was the 4th, the other 2 are cessations, either an analytical cessation or a non-analytical cessation. An analytical cessation is what happens when you have that meditative equipoise and you are able to see something through deep analysis that it will never occur again. It's done through analysis, through the ability to discern emptiness. And it's like, again, what happens on the liberated path. You have the uninterrupted path, where that is immediately offset, that level of obscuration. And then you have the liberated path where the door is closed. It will never occur again. That's a true cessation. It is an analytical cessation. It is unchanging. It's not produced. Yes, there are things that happen in your mind that cause it to arise. But once you have that cessation that occurs on the liberated path, it is an unchanging phenomenon. You always have a lack of, again, these phenomena that are permanent tend to be negative phenomena. You have a lack of that level of obscuration. The non-analytical cessations are things that happen without us getting involved in all that process, which are a cessation of something for the time being, but are not a final cessation in any way. So for example, when you're laughing and having fun with your friends, you're having a non-analytical cessation of anger in your mind, because you don't have it occurring. But it's not a final cessation of anger by any means, because you haven't done the analysis that would remove anger from your mental continuum. So it's a lack that is more temporary, but nonetheless doesn't change from moment to moment, because as long as you have a cessation that occurs of that anger for that period of time, it just stays as that, a cessation. Again, it relies upon other causes and conditions in our mind, but we're talking about a cessation, a state of something not being there. The 4th phenomenon that is classically identified as a permanent phenomenon is emptiness. And that's because, once more, while dawn is here, and dawn is changing all the time, because the components of dawn, the self that is imputed on the basis of this body and mind, are in flux all the time, it's an impermanent phenomenon. The emptiness of dawn is a static phenomenon. It's not changing moment by moment, even though the basis is changing.
But when we say permanent, it can still have a beginning.
Yeah. So Stephen's pointing out, permanent in our teachings here doesn't refer to eternal. permanent can be occasional permanence, which are things that only exist for a period of time, such as the emptiness of dawn, which will only exist for as long as dawn is here, came into existence when dawn came into existence, and goes out of existence when dawn goes out of existence. And I'm sure that there are, there are other ways of looking at it where you can say, there are other things that could be identified as possibilities. You could say the emptiness of a Buddha's mind is a phenomenon that has a beginning but doesn't have an end. The emptiness of a sentient being's mind didn't have a beginning, but it has an end, because you're no longer a sentient being when you become a Buddha. And there's probably something that is both, has no end and has no beginning, so. Any other questions? I guess we should wrap up. It's about 8:16 now, So anyway, had meant to get a little further on this, and I apologize for not getting quite as far, but it's rich dialogue. It's good to have people talking about what's coming up for them in terms of this topic, because once more, this is pretty important stuff that we're going through here, and trying to really discern these two truths for ourselves as best as we can, so that we can then gain some realization of this, and once more impart that wisdom to others. So thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Todd, for yours online. And if there were any other online questions, maybe take note of them, and we'll get to those the next time. Let's go to the prayer book, page 235. We'll do the two prayers that we generally do on Wednesday nights at least, dedicating this positive potential for the welfare of all sentient beings by becoming enlightened ourselves. May we be able to lead all of them to enlightenment. And then also dedicating with the idea of bodhicitta, this very important, very precious mind, that we want to make sure that this mind continues to grow and develop in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Page 244. Again, on 245, we have the paper-clipped prayer that Rinpoche is advising to use for His Holiness for the time being. So we will recite that prayer first, and then we'll go back to page 244 and recite the prayer for Lama Zopa. And as usual, as we recite these prayers, think that we're creating the causes through what we've done here tonight for the good health and long life of all our spiritual guides, so that we and others can continue to have the presence of these beings in our lives now, as well as in all future lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, dedicate for anyone that you're holding in your heart right now, whether it be individual beings that you know who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died, or whether it be for parts of the world where the situations there have moved you to make strong prayers for those people and beings in those parts of the world. Send this positive energy out to those that you're holding in your heart. Think that it becomes the cause for helping them to have their suffering alleviated immediately, and also for them to have all the conducive conditions to help them to find true peace and happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much. Thank you everyone online.